That's kind of the cool thing is he had this idea and he made it happen. Welcome to the D3 Datacast for another week here as the Division III basketball season rolls on. Late January, coming up into the first week of February. We're getting to be into crunch time, Matt. This is a great time. We had the chance to sit down with Cam Fuller, who is this year's chair of the Division III Men's Basketball National Committee. We talk a lot about NPI, tournament outlook, selection, bracketing, all that sort of thing. Those sort of things. It was great to get a chance to sit down with the committee chair and to bring this interview to everyone at a time when I think, a lot of focus is really going to start to turn to that tournament outlook. Every year this time, we see questions come up about, hey, who's going to make it? How are the brackets going to work? Right? We had a chance to talk about that with Cam. Looking forward to that conversation.
Yeah, really, really fun to talk about that with him. In the NPI world, gone are those discussions about who's in, who's out, that the committee has to make, right? Who's like the ninth team in Region 4. They don't have to spend 3 hours on that conversation anymore. So really interested to get Cam's perspective on that and how hopefully that's going to allow them to focus on bigger picture bracket type conversations and things that's going to allow them to do there. So I'll really be interested to see what the committee comes up with this year.
So it was another crazy week in Division III basketball, made even crazier by this big winter storm. Hope everyone out there has stayed safe and is doing okay. If you were in that path, it seemed to really hit almost all parts of the Division III landscape, except for maybe like the Pacific Northwest and Southern California. So a lot of impacts there. We saw games moved. We saw games postponed. Matt, we do this show every week. We think Division III is basketball, but by no means is it the most important thing. Hope everyone out there is doing well. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about the week that was with a new 4-point play. Lead us off as you do each and every week with your play in the North.
Yeah, Zach, I think things are getting really interesting in the OAC. So I'm gonna talk about Mount Union, but really the larger conference in general. Mount Union had a little bit of a tough week this week. They looked like maybe a week ago that they were in a position where they could start to maybe consider running away with the OAC. Like I said, they dropped 2 games this week to make it a tough week. 83-76 at Heidelberg and then 64-50 at Ohio Northern. It gets them into a really interesting race at Otterbein. Otterbein's now ahead by a half game. They already played once, Otterbein and Mount Union did, and Mount Union won that game. I don't think we can count out Ohio Northern out of the race either. They're 1 game behind Mount Union, and they still have 2 to play against Otterbein. So they beat Mount Union 2 against Otterbein, so they can still be their own factor into the OAC race. It's one of these deep leagues every year. Even without John Carroll, though, we're seeing another great conference season this year. And even though 1 week ago Mount Union was undefeated, now they've already picked up 2 conference losses. That means just interesting things ahead for the OAC. Whether it's going to be Mount Union, is it going to be Otterbein, or is Ohio Northern going to get back into this race? Who knows? I think craziness ahead in the OAC. That's the only thing we know about this conference year after year.
Yeah, it was just a week or two ago. We were wondering if this was going to be an interesting race, and it just got maybe even more interesting than we thought it could, and even quicker than we thought it would. Earlier in the year, I wouldn't have said that Heidelberg necessarily would have been, the one that Mount Union maybe needed to watch out for. But I mean, got to give credit to Heidelberg for not only pulling that win off, but they're 4th in the OAC standings right now at 5-4, ahead of a team, Muskingum, that we talked about a lot in the early season. Got off to a great start. They were well deserved in that kind of that talk, but it just kind of shows sometimes the early season views or reads on a team aren't quite right. And we knew that there were still some tough games ahead, and maybe discounted even the overall OAC picture to some of the challenges that it would present to a Mount Union team that really looked like they were rolling there for a while until this week hit. Matt, my play in the North, I'm gonna go over to Indiana and talk about Rose-Hulman. They sit atop the HCAC standings at 9-2, following road wins this week over Manchester and Berea. This looks like a really interesting conference race to watch down the stretch, because there's a chase pack behind Rose-Hulman that includes Mount St. Joseph at 8-3, and then Hanover, Transylvania, Anderson, and Franklin all at 7-4. Not only that, but those 5 teams make up Rose-Hulman's next 5 opponents. So that's a pretty tough stretch for the Fighting Engineers. So we'll see, can they put a stranglehold on the conference, or can they use, four of those five games being at home to their advantage, to really put a stranglehold on the conference? Or is this an opportunity where some of that chaos maybe we're seeing
Yeah.
with that mix of teams at 7-4 rises up the standings, and we're seeing that same kind of level of chaos, in that number one and number two spot?
Yeah, protecting home court becomes very, very important this time of year when you're in close conference races. You can't give up those home games and drop too many. So 4 of the next 5 at home. If they can win a bunch of them, that puts them in good position. But it also means, hey, you've got to go on the road still. So you got to win your home games because you know you're going to probably drop a couple on the road.
All right, let's look east. What do you got there?
Yeah, let's talk about Wesleyan, Zach, taking down number one Trinity, Connecticut at home Saturday afternoon. That was a 64-62 final score, so a really close game. Wesleyan led almost this entire game, but the second half was played really close. Trinity did take a brief lead at times there in the second half. For Wesleyan, Sam Pullman led all scorers with 22 points. I was really impressed, though, with Jalon Watson as well. 16 points in only 14 minutes of action off the bench. He's just a freshman. He looked really good in his game action. For Trinity, it was Henry Vetter that led the charge with 21 points. A big stat, though, in this game for Wesleyan was rebounding. They had a 41-31 advantage there, but particularly good on the offensive glass. 16 offensive rebounds. Giving yourself extra looks is always big. They needed, obviously, every basket to win this game, winning by just 2 points. And the single round robin in the NESCAC makes for an interesting dynamic now, right? Says Trinity only got the one game against Wesleyan. It was on the road for them, so that was a tough game. They're only going to get a team like Tufts once. That's on the road for them as well, so that's going to be a tough game. So a tough schedule for Trinity, even though they were the number one team. They looked like the strongest team in the country coming into this weekend. But this also sets up a really fascinating big weekend for those 3 NESCAC frontrunners. This upcoming weekend, Tufts host Wesleyan on Friday night, and then they host Trinity on Saturday night. So must-watch weekend out in the NESCAC. Those top 3, which are all now really close. It's a close race. I guess Tufts is now leading it, but they have those 2 difficult games. And they get them at home. So again, the single round robin, your home games can be important. Protecting home court can be a big advantage. We'll see if the Jumbos can hold on there next week. But for now, I think Wesleyan's reigning supreme. They got the big win against Trinity. Down goes number 1. They looked unbeatable at times, but here they showed, nope, they are vulnerable just like everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with that single round robin, it almost makes every game doubly important, right? Because now with that head-to-head disadvantage, there's no repeat game. There's no, second round through there that Trinity can look to even that up, right? So it's almost like a two-game deficit
Yeah.
to Wesleyan because they finish tied in the standings there. So, that tiebreaker goes to Wesleyan. So big time impact there. They're, all of a sudden now Trinity is going to need some help, it looks like, and if they're going to lock down that number one seed. Matt, D3Datacast.com, not sure if you're aware, but we have all the same efficiency ratings, daily NPI updates, NPI projections, bubble watch for women's basketball as we produce on the men's side. But this weekly show has always been very much focused on men's basketball. But I'm going to change that up a little bit, throw in something from the women's side that happened this past week, a big time feat from New Paltz's Brianna Fitzgerald. She has a triple double to her credit in her career, but she went a step beyond that in the Hawks win over Potsdam with a quadruple double. And that was despite not even playing the fourth quarter because the game was such a blowout. Fitzgerald finished with 15 points, 12 rebounds, 10 assists, and 11 steals. And interesting little tidbit here, Matt, as I was reading the New Paltz game recap just to get some more of those details. In there, they noted that there have been fewer than 20 quadruple doubles in the history of NCAA basketball, right? That includes all divisions, right? So we're talking Division I, Division II, Division III, and regardless of whether it's men or women, right? So in the history of NCAA basketball, regardless of men's or women's or division, apparently there have been fewer than 20 quadruple doubles. Brianna Fitzgerald got one this past week and gets a shout out from us, which doesn't mean anything as a result.
That's the least impressive thing is getting the shout out from us. But when I saw the tweet,
Absolutely.
I was floored. Quadruple doubles obviously doesn't happen very
Right.
much. And my question was, how rare is this? Great that they had that stat, though. Fewer than 20 or less in all genders, all divisions, NCAA basketball, all time. That's really impressive. So great job by Brianna there.
Let's head south. What do you got in the South this week, Matt?
All right, Zach. Most leagues are kind of making the turn, finishing up their first time through the order if they play a double round robin, but conference play is just getting going in the American Southwest. You mentioned the weather that's hitting, that caused some delays. I think we saw some snow from Belton, Texas. The Hardin Simmons, Mary Hardin Baylor game was supposed to be played this weekend, but that's getting pushed out. So really, ASC play is really just ahead. They're playing with only 4 teams in the league this year. Everyone's playing 6 games in a full double round robin schedule. Only one of those games has taken place. We're getting started this weekend. Very very long non-conference slate for all these teams is over. And where I'm sitting, I think it is going to come down to Mary Hardin Baylor and Hardin Simmons. They look like they're a cut above Howard Payne and East Texas Baptist. And like we said, Mary Hardin Baylor and Hardin Simmons got pushed due to weather from this weekend. So they're going to play back-to-back games now, February 10 and February 14, where I don't know if that's a Tuesday and Saturday or Wednesday and Saturday, something like that, but they're going to play each other home and then away. And those 2 games, right, could decide the ASC race. Interesting when you play the same team back-to-back. It doesn't happen all that often. Every now and then it does, but that'll be kind of the 2 big games in the ASC now, February 10 and 14.
Strange dynamics there in the ASC, as we noted, a week or so ago. There's only like 5 or 6 games left for these teams in the ASC, but they haven't even started conference
Yeah.
play. Just very interesting that they haven't started their conference schedule despite having almost completed their regular season schedule, and then roll right into the conference tournament, I suppose. So uh, not many games, but still a lot of action to take place there in the ASC. Matt, I'm going to go to Washington and Lee for my play in the South. Trine had their much publicized Bacon Night this past week.
Yeah.
Always gets a bunch of buzz on social media, well deserved, as a great game day promotion. But Washington and Lee had I thought, a really cool game day promotion of their own that caught my eye last week. The Generals game against Lynchburg was designated Alumni Day and Student Section Appreciation Game. And the first 150 students were to receive $15 Main Street Lexington gift cards. And, that is not the name of an establishment. That's just a gift card that can be used at over 80 different restaurants, shops, and other businesses in downtown Lexington, Virginia, the home of Washington and Lee. Unfortunately, Matt, rescheduled games, as we know, are never good for attendance. And as this one was moved from Saturday to Friday with the big winter storm bearing down on the South, and the box score listed total attendance of 174. So it seems likely some of those gift cards went unclaimed, or perhaps they were able to be distributed to a few lucky non-student fans who happen to be in attendance. But a really cool promotion. I thought, hey, a free $15 to go
Yeah.
watch a pretty, a good Division III basketball game. That seems like a pretty cool promotion to me. Unfortunately for WNL on the court, they took a 73-59 loss that knocked them out of first place in the ODAC entering the game. They might have been a surprise to see they're at the top of the ODAC standings. But with that loss, they fall one back of Virginia Wesleyan in the loss column, and with other results taking place, one back of Randolph-Macon in the win column.
Yeah, I mean, that's a cool promotion. I don't know if Main Street Lexington has like a Dan Flashes or something. That's what I would use for my gift card, but $15 wouldn't go very far
What do you
because
think about this pattern?
those patterns are so nuts. So
It's
sometimes
not
they can
very
go more.
complicated,
Yeah,
though, is it?
it's not very complicated.
All right. One direction to finish off our 4-point play. Let's go to the West.
Yeah, let's talk about the SCIAC race getting super hot this week. Redlands played Claremont Mudscripts on Wednesday. Redlands got the win. That draws those 2 teams even at 8-1. Redlands then also went on and beat Occidental on Saturday, and Oxy sits at 7-2. Their 2 losses are coming to, guess who? Redlands and Claremont Mudscripts. So you got 2 8-1 teams and a 7-2 team right behind. Redlands and CMS will meet for the second time on February 18. That's the final game of the regular season for Claremont Mudscripts, the second last game for Redlands. We're going to have to see how things go, obviously, but what is that, like 3 weeks out? That could be the de facto SCIAC championship game. Maybe someone trips up one of these teams. Remember, Redlands lost to Chapman already. But again, this fun time of year, 2 teams at 8-1, one at 7-2. Redlands and CMS also, pretty high in the national polls. So the Southern California Intercollegiate Athletic Conference race getting really spicy, really hot. No one's running away with it. Really interesting to see what's going to happen down the stretch.
And the D3 Datacast game of the week hit again because it
Yeah,
was a good one between
overtime.
Redlands and Claremont Scripps there. Unfortunately, I did, being the late game it was, I did have to get caught up on the replay, but I tell you what, that was definitely one to go back to, worth catching on replay, even if I knew the result. More on that later, perhaps. All right, I'll finish things up here, Matt, with opposite day apparently in the WIAC on Saturday, with 3 of the 4 games won by the team that was lower in the standings heading into the day. Stout got a 1 point win at Oshkosh. River Falls defended home court with an 18-point win over Platteville. Lacrosse is trying to get back in the race. They did so with a home win over Stevens Point. Whitewater was the only team to avoid losing to a team that was in lower spot in the standings, and even that was a close one with the Warhawks getting a home overtime win over Eau Claire. Uh, and this is very satisfying, Matt, to look at the standings through play this weekend and see just how balanced and symmetrical it is. We've got 2 teams at 5-2. We got 2 teams at 4-3. We have 2 teams at 3-4, and 2 teams at 2-5. As the first pass through the YX double round robin has completed, and we've seen truly anyone can beat anyone
Yeah.
in this league.
It's been a difficult league to get a handle on, but I think I've just settled on the fact that maybe everyone in the WIAC, or at least like 6 of the 8 teams, you could really put in between like 20 and 35 in the country, and that's why all these games happen is because they can beat everyone. They're all good, and just no one's like number 5 in the country. There's just a bunch of really good teams. One of those deep leagues. No nationally elite teams, maybe, but teams that are good enough to beat anyone in the country still probably.
Absolutely. So that's what caught our eye the past week. Let's talk about the upcoming top 25 poll that will be released on Monday afternoon. Matt, you have a vote. Take us through your ballot.
Yeah, number 1 is dead, and long live number 1. I did not bump Trinity off that spot with that road 2-point loss to Wesleyan. That shows that they are now vulnerable to some degree. They're not, maybe 2 tiers above everyone else. Maybe they're just at the same tier now as everyone else. That kind of draws them pretty close. I think there was a decision to be made for me between Emory and Trinity. Maybe had Chicago won on Sunday, maybe you could put them in that discussion as well. But for me, I still kept Trinity. I still think they're the best team. That's not a bad loss by any stretch of the imagination. Wesleyan was a team I was voting for in my top 25 last week, so that's still like a road single possession game against a top 25 team. That happens, and really something we've talked about now is everyone in the top 25 essentially has some sort of flaw with their resume. So if that's Trinity's worst game, then okay, that's still pretty fine at this point. So I'm comfortable with them at number 1. Emory, I think, holds number 2 in my rankings. Mary Washington jumps up to number 3. Chicago gets kind of blown out a little bit on Sunday by NYU, but I still held with them at 4, not dropping too much. I still feel strongly about University of Chicago. And again, we're at the point in the season where everyone you could play the game like everyone gets a mulligan or everyone has 2 mulligans. I think you're kind of at the everyone has 2 mulligans kind of point in the season if you wanted to think about it that way. Chicago still a bunch of good wins, and some of their losses, like the loss to Illinois Wesleyan, is not a bad loss. That's a road loss by like a possession. So I'm still comfortable with them at 4. And then just going down the list here, Redlands at 5, Tufts at 6, Randolph-Macon down at 7 after they took another loss. Claremont Mudscripts at 8, St. Thomas, Texas 9, Illinois Wesleyan 10, Gustavus Adolphus 11, Montclair State 12, Hood 13, Mount Union 14, Otterbein 15, Wesleyan up to 16, Roanoke 17, Catholic 18, Christopher Newport 19, Calvin slips maybe 5 spots to 20, UW Oshkosh at 21, Endicott 22, Whitworth 23, NYU jumps in after several weeks out of my ballot at 24, and UW La Crosse just peaks back in at 25.
So we talk about Trinity at the top. I think that makes sense. It'll be interesting to see when the full poll is released how many do move off of Trinity. I think um, they've lost maybe that feeling of inevitability that they perhaps had before as the defending champion that seemed to be rolling. I think they're still very much a team that we know a lot about based on what happened last year, even if some of the schedule has been a little bit soft. I think that's maybe been the one knock on them. Right. So it's a balancing act. It doesn't seem at this point in the year that it's fair to give much credit to what happened previously, but it almost still seems like a little bit of a special case with Trinity that the team is so similar.
Yeah.
and performing very similar to how they did a year ago. So that's a difficult balancing act, maybe. So, and at this point, let's bring in Montclair State, Matt. You have them down at 12. I believe at this point they're the lone unbeaten in the mix. I could see some people saying, "Hey, they're the only team that hasn't lost, and you don't even have them in the top 10."
Yeah, I mean they're good. The number 12 is still really high. There's a bunch of they're in that mix of teams I think that get to Fort Wayne could win a national championship. I've said all along that I think that there's a bunch of even teams, and I think now teams like Chicago, teams like Trinity have come back toward the pack a little bit, so that group gets even bigger of teams that are in the mix. Look, I think Montclair State, I think their schedule has just been a little bit soft. I don't think there's a lot of impressive wins. I don't think there's a lot of difficult games on their schedule. It's really interesting to see how they rank on the Massey ratings because he has two kind of numbers on his site. There's the rating, which I think they're at number 8, or at least they were on Sunday, number 8 in the country, and that has a win-loss adjustment. And then he has a power rating, which is more predictive. So if you win almost any game, right, that will improve your rating. And if you lose, that will kind of ding your rating a little bit. But the if you it still matters who you play. Like if you play a bad team and you lose, that's obviously really good. If you play a good team and you win close, that helps you, but only so much. Then he has a power rating, which is the more predictive number, and that would be like if you lost to number 2 and number 3, but by one basket, that would still give you good ratings. So Montclair's kind of win adjusted rating, they're all the way up at number 8, but their power rating, they're back at 37. So I think there's a disparity there between maybe more of a little bit more of a resume type metric. They've won all their games, that's certainly impressive, but also who have they played were maybe not really sold on that, and some of these teams that were not really sold on, maybe you would love to see a little bit higher of a margin as well. Again, not that they're bad. Beat St. Joseph, Connecticut by 5. Like, that's a good win, but that's kind of one of their best ones. Beating TCNJ by 4. Like, that's pretty good, but, like, that's one of their best ones. So I think that's just my problem with Montclair State is there's very few of those games, and none of them are overly impressive in the win margin. And when that's your entire resume, then it's just difficult for me to bump them up too high or to be too confident in them. I'd rather a team take a loss and be kind of winning some good games and maybe losing some of these good games than just struggling to play good competition, I think.
Talk a little UAA in the top 25 ballot here. We saw a couple big weekends, uh, to the plus and to the minus that had an impact to show up in how you're voting this week. Let's start with the team that you put in, NYU. They had a big weekend sweeping their Wash U Chicago road trip. To do that, I think that's the kind of weekend that signals you're a contender for a league championship. Maybe they've dropped their home game to Emory. They lost their opener against travel partner Brandeis, so they were off to that 1-2 start. Maybe not exactly how they wanted to start, but boy, talk about course correcting and really putting yourself right back in the UAA race, sweeping what is probably the most difficult weekend
Yeah.
with those two being on the road is a big time thing for NYU, which gets them back into your top 25 ballot. But more importantly, I think really puts them back um, into that UAA race. Now we've kind of seen it as a 3-team race. Maybe we were just wrong about who that third team was.
Yeah.
Maybe this is really shaping up to be an Emory, Chicago, NYU race with NYU getting those 2 big wins this weekend.
I mean, right. The thing we always talk about with the UAA is everyone's good, and even your bad teams, right, from the conference perspective, are good teams, kind of nationally. They have probably 4, 5, 6 teams who are kind of like top, whatever 30, 40, 50 teams in the country. Those teams can beat everyone, can beat anyone, and then the teams that are just maybe a tier below are still kind of like top 100 type teams. Yeah, really tough for Wash U. I think they've been in most of these games, played close games. A lot of them, how many of these have they just lost by a bucket, right, or 2 buckets? But you got to win some of these games eventually. NYU has now recently found a way to win some of those games, and that brings them right back into the mix here. I think they're really strong. Obviously, I've been voting Emory and Chicago really highly for most of the season. I think Wash U probably is still a good team, but they've just too often been on the losing side of these close battles. Really, that one that they won against St. Thomas, Texas, now in, what was that, like around Thanksgiving or something like that, ends up being maybe one of their most signature wins, that close win at home. And really a lot of these have felt like they've been at home for Wash U too, opportunities to get wins. But yeah, NYU has seized the opportunity. We weren't sure what they were going to be at the beginning of the year. They've looked really, really good at times this season, had some inconsistency, but now maybe they're finding themselves. And if you're going to find yourself in late January into February, that's a pretty good time to find it.
And the other side of that coin there, watch you getting swept in a home weekend, falling out of your ballot this week.
Yeah, at a certain point, like I, I think you're good. You're playing other good teams closely, which means you're about as good as them. But if you're finding ways to lose every single time and they're finding ways to beat you, um, even me, right? The great wash you lover is going to have to drop them out at some point.
Absolutely. So, all right, highlighted the WIAC in the 4-point play, the dynamics there. With that chaos continuing, I just from a top 25 voting perspective, is it almost like you have to just look at all the teams kind of holistically, develop some conviction on a team or two, and then know that there's going to be some bumps along the road, and then you know really need there to be something to convince you of an overall change in the way you think about a team. Because this week you're voting for Oshkosh and Lacrosse. You look at the standings. Lacrosse is in what, sixth place, fifth place in the WIAC. Through the first round. First round through the conference play. How are you reacting to that, right? Because it just feels like either you got to take a stand with a team or two and just know that there's going to be some bumps, or it feels like you're just kind of always in reactionary mode, kind of chasing your tail maybe with the way that this WAC season's playing out.
Yeah, I want to stay away from just reaction mode, but I'm also trying to evaluate the whole season. Lacrosse had a tough start to the conference season. Where did they lose their first four? Or maybe they were 1-4, something like that. But they won the last two. They had, but of the group, they had maybe the best non-conference season, or at least early on. So they had some goodwill built up there. I try to avoid just the if you win, then you move up, and if you lose, you move down. And I think what we're seeing this season, we've been talking about for several weeks now, is there's a group from 20 to 40 that are just so close. And that group kind of beats up on each other almost every week. And teams are going to take losses. That doesn't mean they're automatically out or down. Teams are going to get wins and kind of move up. But there's a bunch of good teams, and I'm just trying to decide every week, who do I think are the top 20? Like, do I think Whitworth would beat NYU, would beat UW Lacrosse? And I convinced myself yes of that on Sunday, but every week is a new evaluation of that process.
It's a bunch of games that I hope we get to see at some point. It sounds fun. All right, the ballot goes in. The new poll comes out sometime Monday afternoon. Usually, it seems like it's about 4 or 5 o'clock that Pat releases the poll as he's able to finally get it put together, chase down whatever straggling voters there may be out there, and get that out. Look forward to seeing what that is. All right, Matt. At this time, let's move into our conversation with Division III Men's Basketball Committee Chair Cam Fuller. We're pleased to welcome into the D3 Datacast Big Box here, Cam Fuller, Director of Athletics at St. Norbert. And for the purposes of our discussion today, most importantly, the chair of the Division III Men's Basketball Committee. Cam, thanks for taking some time to chat with us.
Yeah, Zach, Matt, great to be with you guys.
All right, so let's just jump in. We like to think that we have the best informed audience when it comes to NPI, given how much we talk about it, how in the weeds we get and have gotten into it. So let's just jump right into that. You're a veteran of the Men's National Committee. Just wondering your perspective with that history, kind of, transitioning from the previous regional ranking system to the NPI system now in year 2. Kind of like what's that been like for you, someone on the inside of the National Committee?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think the biggest change from what I'm going to call the debate element to the data element has been the data is kind of the data, right? So now those discussions have changed where we may have spent an hour and a half debating the number 2 and the number 3 team in the country, and then taking that argument and making sure when we were arguing the 18th and 19th best team, we were using the same thought process. Versus now, we spent an enormous amount of time, and I give Luke Fakurtsi, who was the chair at the time, a ton of credit in leading us as we developed the dials. I think we thought it was going to be like 2 calls an hour, both call, and we'd have our dials set. And it was like what felt like 25 calls and 5 hours on each call trying to find the dials. But I think one of the cool things when we developed the dials, we could see was the prior year data. Meaning when we said, hey, we're going to do this to this dial, we could see how that impacted the whole field. So it wasn't like we were totally throwing spaghetti at the wall. We were able to be informed in terms of what those changes would mean for each dial. But, this being the second year of NPI, I think it's allowed us to really live for a year. I think the mistake sometimes we make is we're quick to make changes. So I think having the dial set for at least 2 years, I think is a good thing, because we know we're going to live with it last year and then this year. And I think what we tried to do with the dials is what we tried to do with the human element was, let's value competition against strong teams and incentivize tough competition away from home. And I think our dials have done that.
So as a vice chair last year and the chair this year, that makes you an easy a target for any feedback that might come back your way. Just wondering what kind of things you've heard, maybe from coaches, athletic directors, as they've, been through this NPI world for 1 year and are now living through it for a second year. What's the feedback that's come back to you been like?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is the first year, people just didn't know, right? It's one of those things, you don't know what you don't know. And I think I would say probably all coaches, not just men's basketball, even though I talked to our coaches at St. Norbert, that was the biggest uncertainty, is just, what does this mean? Especially maybe in a sport like football, where they play significantly less games than a sport like baseball. So how do you ensure that the dials kind of are reflective to the sport? So that was something that, as we were going through the process of building the dials, I think we were really trying to be cognizant of what makes sense for men's basketball. And we had some discussions with the women's basketball committee at the time, and our dials are different, and that's okay, because I think that's what the committee at the time thought was best for women's basketball. So that's one of the things that I think what makes Division III really, I think, special is, if you look at our committee makeup, we have 6 administrators and 4 coaches. So we have coaches in the room that are helping make that decision making, versus, Division I and the men's basketball committee, there aren't coaches in the room. So I think that maybe is an element that helps us in Division III, because you have that perspective in the room with you, versus maybe trying to think, hey, what would a coach be thinking in this situation?
You've mentioned those dial settings a couple of times, and how much work went into those initial settings. I think part of the committees, if I'm understanding things correctly, part of your mandate will be to assess those ongoing and maybe make recommendations for changes. From where you're sitting now, do you have any particular dial settings that are maybe on the radar that you want to look at specifically?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I'm excited for after the year, Matt, is just have 2 years of data, and then really see, as we look at each dial individually. I don't think there's one that sticks out like, oh my gosh, we need to change this tomorrow. I think it's more, hey, let's look at the 2 years of data. Let's have a really nice sample size to see what dials maybe did what we wanted to do and what dials maybe didn't. But, I will say, from a feedback standpoint, it's not like, when John Alisi was the chair and we had a great relationship as his vice chair, it wasn't like we were getting calls every day from coaches. It was more of, we just want to see how the dials work, right? And I think at the end of the day, our goal is to get the best basketball teams into the NCAA tournament field. Now, that human element of being able to select that is no longer there. However, the human element is still there on building the dials. So I think that's what our real goal at the end of the day, that hasn't changed. It's to get the best teams in the field. I think now with NPI, we're probably able to spend a little bit more time on building a really good bracket, because we're not splitting hairs over 2 teams. We're really now saying, okay, who's bid, what's geography, and now how can we build the best national bracket possible?
Yeah, I know last year in Fort Wayne and coming off the first year of NPI, we heard a lot from coaches who are around there that it seemed to be pretty common that they just like knowing where they stood, right? On a daily basis, you could see those numbers change and not have to, maybe project how the committee might view some results. So with that human element removed, just kind of curious, this time of year would be really probably filled with preparing for regional rankings and that sort of things with the regional advisory committees, and then also the national committee trying to get together to be able to bring what the regional advisory committees bring to the table and make sure that there's some consistency across those. So I guess as we're talking here in late January, getting into the first part of February, what's going on with the regional advisory committees right now and the national committee, just kind of in the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, good question. We actually just had a call yesterday as a national committee, and I would call that as really like the official kickoff to our season. Obviously, we're engaged before then, but we'll start up next week with what we call our rack orientation, where All the RAC members get on a call with the national committee, and we really kind of take them through the lay of the land for the upcoming year. And then we'll start up that following week with the RAC calls, with the national committee calls. Now, I will say from year one to current year, those calls look completely different, right? My first year, I remember, again, you're trying to really understand the selection criteria and trying to really understand how to get your RAC to understand what the national committee is kind of seeing, believing. So you can ensure that when the RAC creates their rankings, it doesn't get to the national committee and they're completely different, right? So a lot of the committee work was really trying to be a good teacher to your RAC in terms of, hey, here's what we're really looking for, here's what we really value, and here's how we're really trying to make sure the selection criteria is implemented. Versus now, I would say a lot of the work from our RAC standpoint, and we've had some conversations. I know the NCAA, I think they're doing something called Coach Connect this year with some sports where the RAC has kind of gone away and this Coach Connect theory has come into play. That didn't occur for men's basketball. So we'll still have what I would call the more traditional RACs. And one thing that I will say from my standpoint, from a RAC standpoint, what we try to do is a couple of things. One is still be abreast of what's happening within each region. Even though the data is kind of doing that work, it's still really helpful to hear from the boots on the ground of, hey, here are the teams who are playing really well. And hey, here's maybe where they're not showing up in the data, but they got 4 big games coming up and they may take a big jump. So when we're having the national conversations, we can be tracking that when things now maybe are coming into play, like geography, like hosting. So I think that's really where the RAC has kind of shifted. But then also, and this is where you guys are great, is checking the data. Because we saw times last year, right, where maybe some data needed some help. And that's where the RAC, knowing that they're so tuned into their conferences in their region, we can't always count on the Snyder brothers to catch every error. So, but we appreciate you guys because you do keep things honest. But I think that also is it's a little bit in the weeds, but that's something where the RAC has been really helpful as well to be able to really ensure that the data, because if the data is not right, we're only as good as our data when it comes to NPI. And then the last piece, I would say from a RAC standpoint, and I think our committee really sees this, is just the value in creating the relationships, right? So when there is an issue down the road, or when there is something that we need from the RAC down the road, some have said, like, do we even need to meet as a RAC? I still see value in it just from more of that professional development, relationship development standpoint. So definitely the RAC emphasis has shifted. And then I would say, taking a step further on the national committee, our emphasis has definitely shifted as well to really spending less time on debating, splitting hairs on 2 teams versus how can we ensure that we're kind of really projecting out the year so we can build the best bracket possible.
We've got about 5 really fun weeks of basketball left, and then we're going to get to that 2026 tournament. And we get kind of a unique tournament this year with that combined weekend championship of Division I, Division II, and Division III. But that's going to create a unique structure for the whole Division III tournament. Can you maybe just talk through some of the things that we'll get this year and maybe some ways that it will enhance the student-athlete experience, even aside from that final championship game, but I think maybe some opportunities all throughout the tournament?
Yeah, Matt, as I think about the bracket this year, I think the immediate focus goes to the joint championship, but it's so much more than that as you work backwards, where I'm incredibly excited for the joint championship. I think Indianapolis is one of the best cities to have a Final Four at the Division I level, but for us to be able to have the D2 national championship, to have the D3 national championship, to have the NIT, their kind of Final Four in their national championship, I think is going to be a really awesome experience for our student athletes who are we're going to be able to maybe do some things that we haven't been able to do because we're able to really piggyback off the other games that are happening, so I think that's going to be really neat. So as I kind of think about the Final Four weekend, working backwards, you'll have Monday, the Division I national championship. Sunday, you'll have the D2, D3, and NIT championship game. And then Saturday is the D1 semifinals. And then our teams will practice on Friday from a D3 standpoint. And then that Thursday is the NIT semifinals. So from Thursday to Monday, you have some really, really high level basketball across all 3 divisions. And then what also excites me is I think about just how we're going to build the best bracket possible is when we look at working backwards, we'll have the Elite 8 and the Final Four in Fort Wayne. So really Elite 8, Final Four, national championship, all at a neutral site. And then that Sweet 16 will be 8 standalone sites. So versus in the past, obviously less sites with more teams at each site. And then our plan is to hopefully be able to do a Friday, Saturday split where we're playing some of the games Friday, some of the games Saturday to really create as much interest and as much buzz as possible. So, I mean, as we think about the tournament, we're going to have the first weekend, the 64-32. And then once we get to the 16, It's kind of a different bracket, but I think it's going to allow us to potentially build the best bracket possible, knowing that there might be less geographic restrictions, there might be less hosting restrictions. We're also in conversations with the women's basketball committee to see, could we potentially have a situation where, from a Sweet 16 standpoint, could we have a men's and a women's game on a Saturday? That's something that you can't do in the normal bracket because of just the amount of games, the amount of shoot-arounds. So we're in conversations, and Kristen, the chair of the women's basketball committee, has been a great collaborative partner with us, as we just really look at the joint championship and say, hey, there's maybe a new wrinkle or two, and how can we ensure that from a basketball standpoint, not men's or women's, but from a basketball standpoint, we put the best product from a Division III standpoint out there.
Okay, that's interesting. And I'm not going to try to pin you down on this, but I just want to add a little clarity based on, what we just heard. Because in the past, if a women's team had priority and they were hosting, that men's team could not host. But if I'm just making sure hearing you correctly, not that anything is guaranteed or decided, but there's a potential where with that standalone Sweet 16 game, that could be at the same site that is hosting a women's pod. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's a situation that we're working through. There's not any confirmations, or there's not any. I think the big thing for folks to understand is we're having the conversation versus I think in the past it's always been a hard no, because you just can't play the amount of games and have the amount of shoot-arounds to really ensure that our student athletes have the best experience. So I think that's what I'm excited about, is we're having those type of conversations to say, instead of it being a hard no, hey, let's see if it's possible. And if it's not possible, that's fine. At least we explored it, versus telling schools, hey, you can't do it. And I think that's something that I've really tried to impress upon just our committee, which is, let's explore options. And if we get to no, well, at least we explored it, versus thinking the answer is just going to be no. So if we do, again, continue down that path, it's going to take some conversations. And just to get way into the weeds, it's things like shoot-arounds on Friday. When do you have 4 shoot-arounds? How do you structure game times on Saturday? So there's definitely some in the weeds conversations we have to have at the committee level. But again, I think it's worth exploring, because if it can help us build a better bracket and it can have teams being able to host that maybe wouldn't in the past, I think it's worth exploring.
So last year's tournament, the 2025 tournament, was, the first year that the committee had the opportunity to build a bracket with true 1 through 64 seeding, based on those final NPI rankings. Just wondering if there's, any lessons learned from last year, just how those decisions about, whether you consider, grouping teams into broad buckets where maybe they look like a pod number 1, number 2, number 3, or number 4, or you take a wider view and look at teams maybe more through like 1 through 16 seeding per quadrant. Again, just any lessons learned having gone through the process last year that you think might be able to be implemented. And then along with that, you're the athletic director at St. Norbert. St. Norbert was a participant in last year's tournament. I assume that means that you were not able to be directly involved in the actual bracketing process. So I guess as a committee ahead of time, are you guys talking about some of those philosophies or ways you want to think about seeding? And then, whoever it happens to be that is able to be directly involved in that bracketing is kind of then tasked with implementing it. How do those decisions and discussions take place?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing, we've even as a committee started to talk through, like, hey, what might some situations look like on January 23rd? And I'm going to call it the old format, pre-NPI. Those conversations just couldn't start that early because there were so many changes that could happen. So that's something that I'm excited about, is working primarily with our vice chairs right now, and then also with the committee, starting to mock up some things. And how can we get to a point at this time in February where we feel pretty good about where we're at from a bracketing standpoint? And then you raised a good point, Zach, too, knowing that some people may have to leave the room if their team is involved. As I think about my time here on the committee, when Luke Lacurzi was our chair, I think it was maybe the year prior, his team was in the tournament. So yeah, there's always going to be those nuances where you're going to lose a committee member during probably what I'd argue the most important part of our process, which is the bracketing process. So I think that's where the pre-work is critically important, that we don't get to Friday of selection weekend and say, all right, guys and gals, let's get in the room and build a bracket. I think a lot of it is how do we start having those earlier conversations. So that's something that we're going to do as a committee is really start to have those conversations earlier on. And then I think as I think about just the group that we have, we have, I think, a really diverse group that I talked about. We have a conference commissioner, we have a couple athletic directors, a couple head coaches. So I think being able to get those perspectives in the room is going to be really helpful. And then, one thing that we've talked about as a committee too is as we start kind of building the bracket, how do we get some of our committee to really dig in to make sure that we have the best matchups possible, that there's something we're not missing. Because, man, when you're in a room for a weekend and you're there from sun up to sundown, you start to see things that you might not have seen 24 hours ago, right? So to have 10 people in the room, and we all know and love our coordinator of officials, Jim Haney, who's in the room with us as well, in terms of he's starting to map out his officials, in terms of we start to work up some scenarios. So it really becomes, all encompassing. So to have, perspectives both in the room, both on Zoom is really, really helpful for us. So that's what I would say from just an excitement level standpoint for me is how do we start having maybe some of those conversations earlier, knowing to the question of if we lose people down the road, like if St. Norbert's in the tournament, hey, then maybe at least we plowed some ground on some of the concepts unrelated to St. Norbert, that at least we're all on the same page versus we're having the discussion for the first time selection weekend.
So we've talked about the different format this year, just with the combined championship. As part of those discussions, I imagine you're maybe talking through some scenarios that are, allow for maybe some more freedom or creativity. Is that, something that you think is really going to be on the table given the special arrangement this year from the normal kind of 3 weekend format that we're used to?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing will be probably our first task ahead is the Sweet 16 weekend. Really, really coming to a consensus on, are we going with kind of the status quo, or are we going to try to get creative with that weekend? And then I think as I think about just the bracket as a whole, I think we're just going to have to really look at from a geography standpoint. There's always a surprise in there of maybe someone who we thought was going to bid, but for whatever reason didn't bid for whatever reasons. So I think sometimes that can throw a late wrinkle into things. So, in terms of the bracket, I think, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to have some different flexibility this year, but we're always going to still have the geography. We're always going to have, did somebody bid or not bid? And then how do we kind of structure it from a 1 to 64 standpoint, trying not to move teams so far off of their seed path if geography comes into play. And I will say, from our standpoint, we've always built a bracket, and then it's not like we're given, hey, you got 8 flights to use or 2 flights to use. It's really build the bracket, and then we're going to kind of react to it from that standpoint. So that's always been our goal is kind of build the best bracket, and then see where are those limitations. And if there's limitations, then we're going to try to adjust and try to ensure that, we're trying to keep the purity of the bracket while building a national tournament. I think that's what makes Division III special, is that piece is trying to create the national piece to it, not a kind of a regionalized pod tournament.
I think last year was the first year where we got a formal top 8 seeds will be protected in the bracket decree from the championships committee. I think that lines up this year with 8 teams going to Fort Wayne. Does that mean you're just going to be able to start saying kind of 1 through 8 in NPI, they get to be kind of on those top lines and then build from there? Are there any other considerations that I would be missing as far as maybe why you wouldn't end up maybe just seeding 1 through 8 and as your starting point for this bracket?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always going to be the factors in terms of geography, in terms of schools putting the bid. But
Yeah.
I think this year we're going to really probably be more able to accurately seed based on true NPI, as it's more likely within the 500-mile radius with having the 4 additional Sweet 16 sites. We may not have to move teams off of it. So in theory, it'd be great to say yes, but there's still the factors that we can't control as a committee that could move things. But yeah, that's where I think having some more flexibility this year, I think could really be beneficial to your point of could we get the top 8 teams in Fort Wayne?
Yeah, one thing I run into when I'm a nerd and I do like mock brackets just for my own entertainment, I've run into a situation this year where like I ended up with two maybe suboptimal choices that I had to make, like being if I was like a pretend committee member, even outside of like Region 10, which can get its own messy. But I had a choice, like, do I put two teams from the same conference, like maybe two WIAC schools, in the same 4-team first weekend pod that could potentially meet on Saturday? Or do I move a kind of quote unquote deserving host to a different site to maybe the second or third team in that pod to get teams away? I'm not going to make you answer that specific question, but how would you guys talk about those scenarios in the room, right? You know, like, hey, it's not going to be perfect. So
Yeah.
which suboptimal option do we want to pick? How do you go about having those discussions?
Matt, if you were to be at my hip in about a month's time, you're going to be in all of those discussions because they're all going to be happening between now and then. And that's what I think really is, I think about from a bracket building process is wherever we land, we have to be consistent with where we land in general, right? So I think the one thing that we've really tried to do from a committee standpoint in the past is, and again, this was also when, 2-3 years ago, we were kind of doing more of the split hair methods of trying to find teams. Was specific to this of, do we want to have two teams from the same conference match up in the round of 32? Well, if that's what's going to build the best overall bracket, then that might be a consideration we have to have. Or if we say, well, we don't want to do that, but then it's going to lead to 3 or 4 other pinch points over here, well, then that might be something we have to be okay with on the front end. So it's really hard to answer that question in a vacuum, because I think there's so many other factors within the bracket of 64 that it's almost a domino effect. Like, I was playing Jenga with my kids last night, and when you pull one out, you're like, oh, I think we're good. And then my 2-year-old pulls one out and the whole thing falls apart. It's kind of like that with a bracket, right? I'm sure, like you said, as you've been building your mock bracket, where, how many pieces do we want to pull out before maybe the whole bracket starts to crumble? So that's really the approach we've taken is exactly that, where how can we build within the constraints that we have? Like we talk about so much geography and who's put into host, but then how do we ensure that, as we pull the pieces, it's not going to make the whole bracket crumble kind of at the detriment of one situation.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, because we've heard other committees and in other sports talk about trying to avoid repeat matchups if at all possible and teams that played last year. And it probably just comes down to, if it knocks over one domino, like maybe that's okay. If it knocks down 10 dominoes, like, okay, maybe we need to back up and undo that one. And that makes sense that you have a holistic perspective on that kind of thing. Yeah.
So this is the last year of an extended run, really, of Final Fours in Fort Wayne. Just what are your thoughts on this being the last year in Fort Wayne? We've gotten a chance to go over the last few years, and it just seems like they elevate the experience, the atmosphere a little bit each year. A little bit sad, actually, that it's going to be leaving Fort Wayne. Kind of, what do you think? What things are going to be like this final year, and just kind of reflecting on the run that Fort Wayne has had here over the last 6 tournaments?
Yeah. I mean, my observation for any good host city, you need to have alignment within your city. So that's, the airports, that's the hotels, that's the arena, that's the Convention Visitor Bureau. And I think that's what Fort Wayne's done a really good job, is the city alignment. It's more than just Nathan Dennison and the team at the Coliseum. I mean, it's 10 other people in the community that have their arms wrapped around this event, from all of those hospitality areas, to make sure when our athletes touch down, whether it's on ground or through the air, they realize, oh my gosh, this is different than, maybe the regular season game or our Sweet 16 game. Like, this is going to feel different. So that's one thing I think Fort Wayne, they've really kind of bought in and believe that this is their marquee event that they're going to have in their building in March. So I think that's one thing that, as I've observed in my time in Fort Wayne, is they've just been really, really good hosts. And then also, the little small touches, right? It's the signage, it's the police escorts, it's the gift that the student athletes get that really differentiates this, because the reality of it is a very small percentage of student athletes are going to make it to Fort Wayne. So how can we make that feel different? And I think that's something that, as we've talked about, maybe spending less time splitting hairs on teams, we can spend more time on really trying to develop the best experience for our student athletes. And that's something from a committee level we've really dug in more, I would say, the last 2 years is, having more conversations along enhancements and having more conversations along some things that we just couldn't quite get in the weeds in the past. So I give Fort Wayne a lot of credit. And again, it's more than just the arena; it's the whole community that's bought into the event.
So for 2027, the men's championship will shift to Pittsburgh for, I believe, 2 years. And if I've read some championships committee notes correctly, it's possible that there will be some representatives that are in Fort Wayne to try to maybe learn from that experience. I believe you'll be rotating off of the national committee, but I'm wondering during that weekend in Fort Wayne if you will have a role in kind of starting to see that transition from Fort Wayne to Pittsburgh. And so like, what's this really going to be like? Because you'd hope for as great as Fort Wayne has been that, shifting to a new site, you don't lose some of that momentum of how great the event has been in dealing with new people who are, learning from scratch. So kind of like what kind of plans are in place for this transition from Fort Wayne to Pittsburgh?
Yeah, good question. And I would say it's very standard kind of operating protocol from an NCA standpoint when you have a shift in city is to have that city at the prior year so they can really start to hit the ground running. Because once the confetti technically won't fly at the national championship in Fort Wayne, but the point is once their final game is done, like you're kind of on the clock as the next city. So that's something that we're really excited about. The new site, I think it's going to be a great building. I don't know if you guys have had a chance to kind of dig into that, but I think it's going to be a perfect size for Division III basketball. I think location wise, a lot of great basketball on that side of the country. So, we had a number of bids that we looked at from a committee standpoint, and really our priorities were to find the best facility that we think can really enhance Division III basketball. And I think as you look at, hopefully you would agree with this, just the growth of Division III basketball has really started with having, I think, a really pinnacle experience on the back half of the bracket. And then how do you make kind of the prior rounds better each and every year? So I think that's something that we're hopeful Pittsburgh will be able to kind of take the really good work that Fort Wayne's been able to do and kind of continue to elevate the championship. So we're excited to welcome the folks from Pittsburgh to Fort Wayne. And hopefully, like I said, I know I won't be on the committee next year, but hopefully as I'm either there or watching it on TV, we'll see some of the enhancements that city's been able to make to continue to elevate the championship.
Yeah. And we should note, I believe it was just a one-off, but a couple of years ago, they did host a women's Division III Final Four. So not totally starting from scratch, and same venue there, and looking forward to that. Looks like it will be another great venue for future championships.
Yeah.
Well, Cam, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. People have to be a true fan of Division III basketball to listen to Division III basketball podcast. But is there anything you want to leave those fans with about this season, this upcoming tournament, or what we have yet down the stretch?
Yeah, I would just, first off, thank you guys. I mean, it takes a lot of really great people like yourselves who dedicate a lot of your personal time to say, hey, how can we highlight some really good basketball that happens at the Division III level? So I think that's one thing that I think when I first joined the committee, getting to know you guys and getting to know some others that cover D3 hoops, man, this place is in really good shape. And I think that's really a testament to people that see the sport, believe in the sport. And I think that's also what I'd say to the fans is, watching Division III basketball front and center here for the last 4 years, it's really grown my appreciation for just the level of coaches we have, the level of student athletes we have, the level of facilities we have. And that's what excites me is, I think Division III basketball continues to grow and get better each and every year. And decisions like Pittsburgh and decisions like having, I think a really first-class officiating coordinator like Jim Haney, just things like that we've been able to do, I think just continues to elevate the experience. So when that fan tunes into a game during the NCAA tournament, or they tune into hopefully St. Norbert's game tomorrow, but the point is they see, wow, this is really special basketball that's happening at the Division III level.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us for this episode and sharing kind of your thoughts in your role as the committee chair with everyone in Division III basketball. I think we're really looking forward to the tournament. Zach and I are really excited for 8 teams in Fort Wayne this year. I think it's going to be a great one.
Yeah, Matt, Zach, thank you guys both. Appreciate the coverage.
All right, thanks. We'll see you in Fort Wayne. Thanks to Cam for joining us. Really loved that conversation. Looking forward to seeing him and the rest of the committee in Fort Wayne later on this season. As the show moves on, let's talk about last week's picks. Matt, Starting off with Babson and Salve Regina. Babson had them doubled up 48-24 at the half and led by as many as 31 in the second to cruise to victory and easily cover the 6-point computer line. I get the point there. MUW was a 9-point underdog at Webster and got a game high 24 points from Tyler Shepard. It was enough for the Owls to beat the computer line, but not the Gorlocks, as Webster moves to 8-0 in conference play with a 74-67 win. Another point for me there, Matt. All right, you mentioned this one. Hardin Simmons at Mary Hardin Baylor was rescheduled to February 10 because of weather. So we'll pick that up as a bonus pick that week, and we will make sure to update the computer line and give ourselves the opportunity to repick. But we'll keep that matchup in the picks in a few weeks. So hold on that one for the time being. Farmingdale State at Yeshiva was a pick'em according to the computer, but it was anything but as it played out. The Macs were wire-to-wire winners and dominating their Skyline rivals. They were rebounding it. They were dishing it, scoring in the paint, scoring from behind the arc. Yeshiva had it all going in the 84-67 win. Matt, another point for this guy. And the D3 Datacast game of the week, Claremont Mud Scripts took their 16-0 record into Redlands and not only had a great look to win it at the buzzer in regulation, but also a shot in several putback attempts that didn't go down in the closing seconds of overtime. However, on the final of those attempts, CMS was fouled with 0.4 of a second, but neither free throw went down. Redlands comes away with the 1-point win. But the computer line was Redlands by 5. So, Matt, that's a point for you. You didn't get completely shut out. So that's a 3-1 week for me. I move to 29, 28, and 2 on the year. A 1-3 week for you. You are now 38, 19, and 2. So still a sizable lead. But, Matt, I need to start stacking these kind of weeks on top of each other.
As my first real stinker of the season, my second best result of the week was the reschedule game, not counting against me. So a little bit of a tough one for me. So we'll see how it goes this week, Zach. Let's get into this week's picks. Our first game, Washington and Jefferson. They're going to be 1-point favorites on the road at Chatham. How do you see this one playing out, Zach?
Yeah, I don't really feel comfortable picking a road team in basically a pick'em game at another conference contender, which Chatham definitely is. But, Matt, I like this Washington Jefferson team. I like the way they played. They got I think it was a 15-point win, a pretty convincing win over Chatham at their place. That leaves plenty of room to apply some home court advantage. That's quite a bit of shift. So I'm going to stick with the Presidents in this matchup.
Yeah, I still my only in-person viewing of them this season was the 2 games they played at the Great Lakes Invitational. They look great. They were really, really good. I know they've taken some losses since then, but I'm just going to stick with what I saw there and say that they can beat Chatham on the road by more than 1, and I'm going to go with W&J. Our second game is Southern Maine, 4.5-point underdogs on the road at Mass Boston. Zach, your pick.
4.5 starting to get, it's not a big computer line, but starting to get that point where we got to think about it. But I think there's been some good things going there at that UMass Boston program this year at home. Let's lay the points and go with the Beacons.
Yeah, Zach, I'm going to go in the same direction here. UMass Boston has looked pretty good at times. I think they've been a strong program. I'm going to say that they can lay the 4.5 and still win that one. Going out to game against 2 CCIW contenders. This is the second matchup of the season between Carthage and Illinois Wesleyan. Illinois Wesleyan are 3.5-point favorites at home.
Can Carthage win this game? Yeah. Will Carthage win this game? I'm less convinced, right? I think Illinois Wesleyan's been the much more consistent team. Every time it even seems that Carthage is maybe rounding into form that you think that they can be, there's something that, feels like a step back for them. So pretty close computer line here with 3.5, but I'm going to lay those with the home Titans.
Yeah, Zach, I saw a quote this week attributed to, I think, Illinois Wesleyan player Mason Funk, who said something to the effect of, we're playing like a big game team, but we need to be an every game type team. Well, I think regardless, this qualifies as a big game. So if that's the case, then Illinois Wesleyan is going to show up. I think this is an important game for them. Winning by a little bit more than 2 possessions, I think, is feasible here. So I'm going to go with the Titans at home to cover the 3.5-point computer line. Next one is another big conference race, Zach. Mount Union at Otterbein, 2 teams we talked about in the 4-point play. Otterbein are 3.5-point favorites at home as well in their game. How do you see this one?
Yeah, this is suddenly a huge game in the conference race. a couple weeks ago you thought this might be the place where Mount Union could get tripped up. Well, they already tripped up twice this past week, so there's no more screwing around for the Purple Raiders in the OAC. Getting 3.5 here, I'll take the points.
Yeah, Zach, I thought the same way. I think that they're going to be in practice, going to be a little bit mad this week. So I'm going to go again the 4 games in a row the same direction as you, Mount Union, to keep this one close at least against Otterbein in that conference race. And Zach, our D3 Datacast game of the week is a really big one. Maybe not quite as big as it could have been with Chicago losing a game, but still really, really big. This game did move 2 points with Chicago's kind of underperformance on Sunday. But Emory are now half-point favorites on the road at Chicago on February 1st, Zach. Big one. How do you call it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably fitting that this one's a coin flip because I really feel like it's a coin flip type game just because I don't know that I would have any conviction either way. Let's just talk through it a little bit. This is the Sunday road game, which can always be tricky, for Emory. But also, that didn't seem to matter with Chicago hosting NYU. That was certainly the case with NYU trying to play that second road game of the weekend. They had a great weekend. Chicago played that without Nick Roper. Don't know what his status is going to be, and I tell you what, I think without Nick Roper, that really changes my outlook of this Chicago team. I don't love that he had the injury, came back, and now is out again, right? So that doesn't really give me confidence that he's going to be available. Don't know the situation, don't know the details, have no information if he's going to be available this next weekend or not. But I just don't like that, kind of return and then be out again type deal. So I don't know. Maybe it sounds like I'm talking myself more into Emory here, though. But this could be a kind of a backs against the wall type game for Chicago as it relates to the UAA race. So give me the home Maroons, I guess.
Yeah, Zach, the Nick Roper injury situation I think does make a big difference for Chicago. He's a key for them. Thinking about Emory though, that's the Sunday game. They would have played WashU on Friday, so a little bit of an easier game on Friday, and now a difficult game on Sunday. So I see if they'll take advantage of that one. Maybe they'll just be focused on Sunday here. But I think Emory's really good. Like I said, I had them at number 2. Did consider them for a minute maybe at number 1. But I think they're one of the best teams in the country. Here's an opportunity to show it. Maybe their biggest road game of the season, one of their biggest road weekends of the season. So I'm going to go with Emory to win this game against Chicago. That's the picks.
All right, let's wrap up with a mailbag. It's been a big time week, Matt. There's some big time things going on in Division III basketball, and it's been fun to talk about it here in the show. But let's get wrapped up here with the mailbag. First one comes from JR on Twitter X. Can you explain the game leverage on the predictions page in a little more detail? Of course, if you go to d3datacast.com, along the top bar, there's a little predictions drop down for men's and women's. You can click on, either the MBB score predictions or the WBB score predictions. And if you go at that listing, it'll kind of give you the computer line for every single game, right? This is the same computer line that we pick in our weekly pick segment. But also along that to the right side, there's a column that'll say away leverage, home leverage, and then total leverage, right? So it's a more detailed explanation that Jay is asking about on these pages where it lists a leverage score for the game.
Yeah, so this is a result of the simulations that we run, kind of rest of the season simulations. 10,000 runs almost every day, simulating games still to be played, and then seeing where teams end up. So the leverage number comes from if a team wins that particular game, how many times then did they go on to make the NCAA tournament? Versus if they lost that game, how many times did they go on to make the NCAA tournament? So if they won and made it 78% of the time, and if they lost and then made it 60% of the time, the leverage is the difference between those two numbers. So that would be 18%. It's really the kind of the percent increase or the importance of the game from the standpoint of how now likely are you to make the NCAA tournament given that you won or lost it. So the difference between winning and losing in the simulations as far as overall tournament odds. And that's not just at large bid. That includes how often did they win the Pool A, because conference positioning and seeding and things like that go into effect as well.
So let's talk about it a little bit more. Here's the way that I've been using it, Matt, is kind of thinking about teams that might be kind of bubbly, right? Like if you're a fan of a team that could be on the bubble and you want your team to have the best at large odds possible, you might look at a game. I'm thinking like this past weekend, we saw a game between Bowden and Colby, right? So I think that that was one where you saw a bigger number with Colby, right? So winning that game was important for Colby's tournament chances, and you saw maybe a smaller number with Bowden. So like if you're a fan of a bubble team, you probably want the smaller number team to win. Now, of course, this isn't just at large odds. This is overall tournament odds. So it's going to, include some automatic bid situations. But is that a good way you think, Matt,
Yeah.
that fans could be using this for a game that they might not care about or they might not know how to feel about? Like, uh, if I'm a fan of a team like, let's say, Otterbein, and I'm hoping that Otterbein has the best chance at a at large bid. If I'm looking at this random Nestcat game, this is a way that could inform me as a fan of kind of like a rooting guide type thing. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah, I think in general, if you're a fan of a bubble team, then you want those teams with high leverage numbers to lose because that means there's a big difference between if they won and lost and how likely they were to get in the tournament. So you want them to lose and get those lower numbers. I think that's a good way to look at it. It's also just a number if you're a general fan. It goes into that game score, which is on the far right, which takes into account how good the two teams are, what's the leverage, total leverage of the game, and how close is the game likely to be. Just kind of a measure of how interesting might this game be as well. But yeah, if you're for a rooting guide, if you're a bubble team fan, you generally want higher leverage teams than to lose.
Second one here's from Greg Lewis at glewis8319 on Twitter X. What teams could potentially be out as hosts over the first 2 weekends due to both men's and women's
Yeah.
squads being successful so far this year? Interesting timing for this one, Matt, because earlier in the episode we
Right.
heard from Cam Fuller that it might be that no one is out from being blocked from hosting that second weekend, as there apparently going to be or have been discussions about the same site between men's and women's not quite being the non-starter that it has been in the past because of the different nature of that standalone Sweet 16 weekend on the men's side. So really, I think maybe what we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about is just that first weekend. This will be a men's priority year. So I think we're probably looking at alignment between the top 16 on the men's side and if there's anyone in there that could block a top 16 type team on the women's side.
Yeah, and to me, it's not looking like I don't think there's any slam dunk women's teams that will now be on the road. There's not a ton of automatic overlap between the kind of what's the top 16 is looking like in women's and men's, but just kind of looking. I use a lot of Scott Peterson's numbers, although we have similar stuff on D3 Datacast. But check out Scott Peterson; he does a lot of great women's basketball data coverage as well. So using his stuff and our stuff. UW Oshkosh, they're really highly ranked on women's. Their men's team could make a run and maybe be a top 16 type team and put their women on the road. That's possible. Emory, I think, is currently in the top 16 kind of projections for both men and women. So maybe their men host and maybe their women go on the road. Wash U, we just talked about their men's team slipping a little bit, but still could maybe get themselves back into that type of a position. We'll have to see. Or even maybe just being a geographic host, not sure. But their women could be a team that would be in a position. And Illinois Wesleyan, I think maybe they're just on the outside of both top 16 type projections right now, maybe really close to inside on the men's. But they're strong enough on both sides that they could get into that top 16 type position. So maybe their men's team would push their women on the road. So those are some teams that I'm looking at this point. For second weekend, I know we had that conversation where it said that they're having the discussion, right? Could we host a standalone Saturday men's game at the same site where there was a Friday, Saturday women's pod for the second weekend? It'd be great if that is shown to be kind of like a possibility, but it's also very likely that there's no sites that are selected that are the same, right? That's a possibility as well. I think in women doing the 4-team pods, you're kind of looking like the top 4 would be in line. Right now,
Right.
I don't see too much alignment of what you might see as like a top 8 for men's. Again, maybe like a UW Oshkosh goes on a big run and gets themselves into position for both, or maybe like an Emory women go on a big run and get themselves in that position. Although that's tough geography to host down at Emory anyway, so we'll have to see.
Well, in
But
that
will be
weekend, you're going to
interesting.
be looking at eight. That weekend, you're going to be looking at 8 different hosts on the
Yeah,
men's side, right?
right.
So, who knows how the bracket gets configured? Maybe Oshkosh gets through. Maybe there's an upset on the men's side, and suddenly even if there's an Oshkosh team that isn't necessarily top 16, if whoever comes out of that other pod is maybe kind of an upset situation,
Yeah.
then they could still be in position to host, and that could be a possibility where you've got someone on the women's side who is in that top four range, and a men's team that could also be seen as a host. So part of it is just going to be dependent on how the bracket gets set up and who actually gets through to that second weekend.
And I would not be shocked if we get, a section of the bracket where two, like, let's just call them underseeds, non-top seeds, not non-hosts, do get through for the men's side, and now we're looking for a completely different host. We talked about how many even teams there are in the country already. So yeah, that's a very good possibility, is that someone from outside that top 8, even outside the top 16, could be seated in line to host for the second weekend for men's.
All right, one more to finish up this week's mailbag from Caden Henderson at Caden Center on Twitter X. Thoughts on how the review/challenge system has been implemented, specifically in terms of how lengthy some of the reviews can be. Had a 3 to 4 minute delay before the game deciding free throws in the CMS Redlands game to review the clock. Feels like it can ruin a game's flow. Yeah, definitely
Yeah.
is unfortunate that sometimes we have those long breaks. I know in I don't know why it takes that long to review the clock. I do know that it was adjusted as I did the kind of recap there, that those free throws happened with 4/10 of a second left. I think originally there was 2/10 left, so there was an adjustment there. I don't know if that was the full review. Don't know why it took that long to adjust from 2/10 to 4/10. But Matt, I think in general we haven't seen, or at least in what we've witnessed, hasn't really been a huge game changer to have replay sitting alongside the court there at the GLI. We heard some of the discussions about whether or not to challenge certain things, and it was sometimes noted that they're just not going to be able to see anything. Right? This is even some of the great multicam broadcasts. This is not like the NFL where they've got cameras all over the place and really good slow motion replays. Right? There's just going to be certain things that's going to be very difficult to go back and do a rewind on the live broadcast, the live stream, and get a definitive look at a lot of these type of things.
Yeah, I think overall, I haven't seen a lot of disruption. There's been a few slow ones, but they don't seem to be too constant, at least games that we've watched here up in Michigan. I do recall watching a live stream of a game. I think it was lacrosse versus Oshkosh. And the last 2 minutes of that game, or whatever, I was tweeting about it, took like 40 minutes to play. There were several reviews in that one. It kind of felt like at times, I mean, it was a close, intense game. It almost felt like maybe the officials were second guessing themselves at every out of bounds call, and then we're going to the monitor. And I forget like which has to be implemented or instigated by coaches versus what the officials can do and all that stuff. So that one,
I think that
seemed
late
like
in the
there
I
was
think
too
that late in
many.
the game, it's not coach's challenge, right?
Yeah,
It's
it's
officiating.
too many of those are like, we're not going to be able to see anything with most of the broadcast angles that we have, and let's just not go to the monitor every single time. I hate that. The other one, I mean, I get, but I don't like is there was a game. I think it was at Calvin, maybe the Albion game, where they went to the monitor twice because a player got hit up in the head level, which you want to take player safety very seriously. But it was very clear from the game action that this was never going to come back as any sort of flagrant foul. It was just basketball plays being made, and a player happened to make contact with the other player's head. And at no point did I ever think that they were going to come back from either of those reviews as a flagrant. But I think that's kind of like an automatic thing, that if they see that there was head contact, they have to go back and look at it. And to me, that was more of a big thing. Like, come on, we know this is going to be just play on. Let's go. Let's get moving. But thankfully, I don't think it's been too much of a slog.
It hasn't, and I'm glad it exists overall, because it can be really important for those buzzer beater end of game
Yeah.
situations. If there's any question about whether a shot got off in time, I think that a lot of times, especially we've got the backboard lights that can make it very easy to see. Yes, it did
Yep.
leave the hand, or no, it was late. And it's just really unfortunate when something like that is messed up and there's not an ability to review. So just for that alone, I'd hate to see something like that, especially in a tournament setting, uh, to go wrong, and
Yeah.
uh, there to be no mechanism to review that, right? So is it perfect? No. Is it gonna ensure every call is ultimately correct? Also, no. But I mean, I think it's an overall good safety to have in place.
Yeah. In some ways, I'm glad that we don't have multiple high definition cameras from every angle. I think that can be kind of annoying in like major professional sports when you have to go frame by frame from all these minute details. I kind of like, let's make it a quick review. If you can't see it from a normal broadcast, you can't tell. Let's just say stick with the call. Let's try to move on, make it fast, and go with the flow rather than take all these really long reviews.
Yeah, I mean, if it's something that's uh, supposed to be, indisputable evidence, right? If you can't say that within 30 seconds or 60 seconds, well, then it kind of by definition is kind of inconclusive,
Yeah.
right? And so let's just not spend more time than we need to. Let's move the game along.
Yeah.
All right, we'll end it there, Matt. That wraps up another great show. Had a great time with you. Let's say thank you to our great group of supporters at patreon.com/D3 Datacast. These people partner with us financially to support the efforts that we do doing this show, putting all the information that's out there on D3 Datacast. We put it out there for everyone, and there's no paywalls, no ads bogging down the site, and it's all because these people have decided that it's something worth investing for and bringing forward to the entire Division 3 community, and we're grateful for having their partnership in that effort.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone on this list. Patreon.com/D3 Datacast will get you the support options. There's a $3 a month and a $5 a month tier. Pick whatever one you want. We just love it so much that you watch these episodes and support Division 3 basketball players and programs with us.
And special shout out to Jeff for joining us at the Great Job Team tier level this past week. Always great to see new people show up on the list. Love to get the names out there every week, the people that we want to say thank you to because we couldn't do it without them. But for now, we'll say goodbye. Enjoy another great week of Division 3 basketball. We'll see you back here next week on the D3 Datacast. Good job, team.
Good job, team.